In the beginning, before marble gleamed and bronze sang, there was only the raw wind of the Eurotas Valley, howling through gorges like the breath of forgotten gods. Sparta was not born from love, nor built from peace. It was forged in the dark womb of necessity, in an age when the soil was thin, the enemies many, and weakness meant extinction. The people who would one day call themselves Spartans learned early that mercy was an illness they could not afford. And so, from the cradle of dust and war, they conceived a new creed. Life would serve only strength, and strength would serve the state. They said the first Spartans were descendants of Heracles himself, the demigod whose blood carried the fury of Olympus. From that divine seed came the Dorian invaders, men of iron and thunder who swept down from the north and seized the valley of Laconia as wolves claim a den. The conquered people, the Helots, were chained to the land, condemned to feed their conquerors. And the conquerors themselves became prisoners of their own vision, bound by a single purpose, to breed a race so perfect that even the gods would tremble before it. In the smoky halls of early Sparta, the elders spoke of a dream revealed by Apollo, a city without weakness, a people born without fear. They whispered of a covenant between mortal and divine, that if Sparta purified its blood, purged its softness, and lived for war alone, it would never fall. So the laws of Lycurgus, that phantom lawgiver whose face was said to shine like the sun, came into being. Whether man or myth, no one could say. But his word was iron. He decreed that no Spartan should live for himself, nor die for himself, but for the polis, for the greater body that was Sparta. And the body could not be strong if the flesh that composed it was flawed. Thus began the first and most terrible ritual of Spartan life, the breeding of perfection. When a child was born in Sparta, it did not belong to its parents. It belonged to the city. The midwives, hardened women whose hands knew both birth and battle, would lift the newborn under the pale morning light and examine it with eyes trained to find imperfection. The slightest deformity, the smallest sign of weakness, a twisted limb, a thin cry, a trembling breath, and the verdict was passed. Such children were taken to Mount Taygetus, to the Apothetai, the place of rejection. There, amid the stones and eagles, they were left to die. The act was not cruelty in their eyes, but purification. The state demanded only the strong, and nature was a tool to be refined by human will. Some said that the spirits of those abandoned infants never truly died. At night, the shepherds claimed, faint cries drifted down from the mountains, carried on the cold winds, not of sorrow, but of vengeance. They became the unseen ghosts of Sparta's conscience, whispering into the ears of mothers who bore again, asking whether the next would live or perish. For those who survived the judgment, childhood itself was another crucible. The boys were raised not by mother's tenderness, but by the agug, the state's unrelenting forge. They learned to fight, starve, endure pain, and obey. But what made them truly Spartan was not what they did. It was what had been done before they were born. The city itself had chosen their lineage, pairing men and women as if breeding prized stallions. Marriage in Sparta was not the union of hearts. It was the weaving of bloodlines. The state arranged couplings with a logic colder than steel, deciding which families would mix, which bodies would merge, which traits would pass on to the next generation of warriors. Love was not forbidden, but it was irrelevant. The true marriage was between the individual and the city, and so the breeding of Sparta became both sacred and profane, half ritual, half law. The elders, the Gerousia, watched over it as priests might guard a divine fire. To them, lust was a resource, passion a weapon, and reproduction an act of strategy. Spartan women were unlike any others in Greece. In Athens, they were kept behind veils, silent and unseen. But in Sparta, they trained in the gymnasia, raced, wrestled, and sang war songs to the rhythm of drums. The state wanted them strong, their bodies hardened, their wombs prepared to bear sons like bronze. It was said that Spartan mothers gave birth not through pain, but through pride. And if the child was male, she thanked the goddess not with tears, but with a spear laid beside the cradle. Marriage ceremonies were as strange as they were brutal. The bride's head was shaved, her clothes taken, her body oiled and wrapped in a man's cloak. The ritual symbolized transformation, from woman to vessel, from individual to instrument of the state. After that night, the couple might rarely see each other, for the husband remained in the barracks until his 30th year. The state believed that passion restrained was passion intensified, and thus stronger offspring would result from lovers who met like conspirators. In this way, Sparta harnessed even nature's wildest impulses, taming them in service of its design. But desire is never so easily contained. Beneath the facade of control, strange customs thrived, whispered arrangements sanctioned by the elders. If a man was old but strong of spirit, he might be encouraged to let a younger man impregnate his wife, provided the youth was of fine stock. Likewise, if a woman was renowned for her beauty and vigor, her husband might lend her to another so that the city might gain more worthy sons. These exchanges were not considered shameful. They were offerings, sacrifices on the altar of perfection. And yet, behind the proud discipline there was something darker, a quiet horror that no law could disguise. The women who could not conceive were shunned, not for sin, but for failure of duty. The men who sired weak children were whispered about as if cursed by the gods. The bed became a battlefield where victory was measured not in pleasure, but in progeny. As centuries passed, the line between divine will and human arrogance blurred. Priests began to claim that the gods themselves guided the selection of mates. Oracles at Delphi were consulted, sacrifices made, omens read in the entrails of lambs. A malformed birth could doom a family's honor for generations. A perfectly formed child was hailed as proof of divine favor. In this sacred obsession, the Spartans became priests of their own flesh, sculptors carving not marble but blood. Foreign visitors found it both admirable and monstrous. They saw women who moved with the grace of warriors and men who seemed born from stone. But they also saw eyes that burned with something colder than human warmth, a look of people who had been bred, not raised. Plato himself admired their discipline, but warned of the danger of turning love into calculation. Yet Sparta did not listen. To them, emotion was weakness, and weakness was death. And so, generation after generation, the experiment continued. The city grew strong, feared, envied. But beneath the strength, something fragile began to crack. A quiet curse that would take centuries to reveal itself. For when a people reduce life to breeding, they forget the unpredictable power of the soul. The gods who had once smiled upon Sparta began to turn away, disturbed by the arrogance of mortals who thought they could perfect creation itself. The mountains remembered. The ghosts of Tagetus watched. And in the stillness of the night, when even warriors slept, the wind whispered through the valley, "You have traded love for power, and power for emptiness." Sparta did not hear. The drums of training continued to thunder. The cries of the Agog echoed through the fields, and the next generation of mothers prepared to bring forth sons who would never know fear or tenderness. The cycle was unbroken. The breeding machine, divine and diabolical, marched on. Yet, even in this iron city, cracks of humanity remained. Some women, it was said, secretly prayed for daughters, hoping the gods would spare them the sword. Some fathers, returning from war, wept quietly over the graves of the sons they had been forced to abandon on Taygetus. And some youths, raised in the Agog, began to wonder whether perfection was worth the price of their hearts. But in Sparta, doubt was treason, and treason was death. So they buried their doubts beneath silence, just as their ancestors had buried their unwanted children beneath stone. Still, the silence could not last forever, for every system built on fear eventually meets a moment when fear turns inward. And as Sparta's power reached its height, so too did its shadows grow deeper. What began as a pursuit of strength was turning into something else, something colder, stranger, and more desperate. The city that had once sought to control nature now found itself consumed by it, trapped in the very laws it had written. The next generation would see the experiment taken to new extremes. Breeding was no longer just about bodies. It was about the soul of the state itself. The line between human and weapon blurred until it vanished altogether. And so, under the red light of dawn, the forges of Sparta continued to burn, not with metal but with flesh, shaping, discarding, perfecting. The city that sought to defy the gods had become a god in its own right, cruel, immortal, and insatiable. But gods, too, can die. By the time Sparta's laws had ripened into legend, the breeding rituals were no longer seen as customs. They were destiny itself. The city had become a living organism, pulsing with the rhythm of discipline, fear, and sacred pride. Every heartbeat in Laconia belonged to the state. Every breath was measured against the perfection of the ideal, and every womb was a field from which Sparta harvested its future. In the cold dawn light, before the sun lifted its red crown over the Taygetus peaks, Spartan maidens trained in silence, barefoot. Their bodies gleamed with oil, their limbs sculpted by years of exercise. They wrestled, raced, hurled the discus, not for sport, but for prophecy. For in the eyes of the elders, every movement revealed destiny. The strong would bear the strong, the weak would not bear at all. Beauty, agility, endurance, these were omens of fertility and promise. To be chosen as a mother of warriors was not a privilege, it was a summons from the state, a sacred command. Among them moved the matrons, older women whose own sons now trained in the agage. Their faces were lined with pride and something harder, the quiet knowledge of sacrifice. They had learned long ago that the womb was a weapon, that the cradle could be as decisive as the spear. The matrons oversaw the maidens' training, teaching them the songs of strength. Hymns to Artemis, goddess of childbirth and war, whose statues stood in every gymnasium, bow drawn, eyes merciless. They taught that the goddess loved not the gentle mother, but the fierce one. She who could bear pain without cry, who could give birth while the drums of war thundered in the distance. In the evenings, when the young women returned home, their mothers told stories of Lycurgus's vision. They spoke of the time when Sparta was still soft, when men grew fat with peace and women pale with idleness. Lycurgus, guided by Apollo's oracle, had cast away gold and luxury, forbidding anything that weakened the body or clouded the mind. He had commanded that children be raised communally, that husbands dine with their comrades, that love serve only the polis. In other cities, the mothers said, men love women. In Sparta, men love Sparta. And the daughters nodded, though in their hearts they wondered what love meant when it was owned by the state. The sons, meanwhile, were molded in fire. From the age of 7 they lived in barracks, sleeping on reed and eating black broth, a soup of pig's blood and vinegar said to harden the spirit. Their bodies were trained to endure hunger, thirst, and pain. Their minds were stripped of softness until only obedience remained. But even here, the unseen hand of the breeding ritual guided everything. The boys were reminded that they were not individuals, they were products of selection, descendants of the strongest. The thought filled them with pride, but also with a quiet terror. To be strong was not a gift, it was an obligation. If they faltered, they dishonored the blood that had been chosen for them. In secret moments, some whispered that the gods themselves had grown weary of Sparta's arrogance. There were stories told around dying campfires of strange births, infants with 2 sets of eyes or none, women struck barren though they had once been fruitful. The priests at Delphi began to murmur of imbalance, of hubris against the natural order. But the ephors, the high magistrates of Sparta, silenced such doubts. To them, these were not omens of warning, but signs that the gods were testing their resolve. Purity must be paid for, they said, and the gods always demand a price. So the rituals grew harsher. Marriage became not only a civic duty but a state-enforced ceremony of selection. When a man reached his prime, strong, scarred, and proven, the elders would choose for him a woman whose physique matched his valor. But choice was an illusion. The pair might never have spoken before, they might never speak again after. Their union was a brief storm, arranged by council decree and sanctified by nothing but necessity. Witnesses would sometimes stand outside the chamber, ensuring the ritual was completed. Such intimacy was no longer private. It was an act of obedience. Yet there was another side, a secret economy of desire that slipped through the cracks of discipline. Young Spartans, their bodies blazing with unspent passion, found in each other the affection forbidden elsewhere. Bonds between men were not only tolerated but encouraged, believed to strengthen comradeship on the battlefield. Some said that these relationships were truer than marriage, for they were not bound by law or the expectation of offspring. They were, paradoxically, the only form of love left untouched by the state's breeding schemes, and so, within the barracks, among the clatter of shields and the smell of sweat, the last remnants of human tenderness survived, in the eyes of warriors who knew they would die together. Meanwhile, the women bore the weight of the city's dreams. A Spartan mother was told that her duty ended not with childbirth, but with death, for she must give her sons willingly to war. They sang them lullabies not of sleep, but of courage. "Come back with your shield," they would say, or on it. To outsiders it sounded monstrous, but to Spartans it was purity, the ultimate expression of loyalty. Their entire existence was woven into the myth of sacrifice, and the breeding rituals were its root. One story, told by the poets of other lands, spoke of a woman named Theodora of Amyclae, a Spartan of great beauty and strength. When she failed to bear a son after 3 years of marriage, her husband petitioned the council to lend her to another man, one known for his virility. The arrangement was approved without shame, for it was deemed a patriotic act. Yet when the child was born, deformed and frail, Theodora refused to surrender it to the apothetae. She hid the baby in a cave near the river, nursing it in secret until the ephors discovered her. The punishment was swift: exile. But some claimed the child survived, grew in the wild, and became a prophet, a voice crying that Sparta's obsession with strength would lead to ruin. Whether the tale was true or not, it spread like wildfire, whispered by helots and merchants alike. The state denied it, but could not erase the unease it left behind. For even within the iron laws, the people could feel the strain of their own creation. The Spartan population began to shrink. The constant wars, the rigid selection, the rejection of the weak, all conspired to drain the lifeblood of the city. Fewer children were born each year. The breeding rituals became desperate, frenzied. The council encouraged polygamy among the elite, hoping to multiply the best bloodlines. They ordered ceremonies where men and women were matched publicly under torchlight, chosen like livestock in a market. Songs were sung to drown the unease, but the air trembled with a sense of doom. The gods, once invoked to bless fertility, now seemed silent. At night, priests sacrificed to Apollo and Artemis, their chants echoing through the temples. They begged the gods to renew the strength of Sparta's womb. But when no miracles came, some whispered that the answer lay not with the divine, but with darker forces. It was said that secret rituals took place deep beneath the city, rites where women drank potions made from herbs that grew only on Tagetus, herbs that tasted of iron and ash. Others claimed that Spartan maidens were taken to the oracle and made to lie in sacred chambers, waiting for visions that would ensure divine conception. Whether these were symbolic or real, no one dared ask. The line between faith and horror had long since vanished, yet the city persisted, refusing to see the rot beneath its perfection. The soldiers remained fearless, the women proud, the children disciplined. But every ritual, every birth, every marriage was now haunted by a quiet dread, the sense that they were imitating something divine without understanding its purpose. They had made themselves gods of their own creation, but even gods, when made by men, can die. And still, the elders preached purity. Still, they demanded that the young honor the bloodline above all else. The breeding rituals became pageants, acts of worship in themselves. The people gathered in the great square to watch the selection ceremonies. Trumpets blared, flutes shrieked, and pairs were led forth. Men with torsos like stone statues, women with eyes hard as obsidian. The high priest proclaimed that through them, Sparta would endure forever. The crowd roared, half in pride, half in fear, for they knew what happened to those who were not chosen: quiet exile, nameless death, oblivion. But the winds of Greece were changing. In Athens, poets sang of love, freedom, and thought. In Thebes, philosophers debated the nature of justice. Even in far-off Persia, kings ruled by the art of persuasion rather than the lash. Yet Sparta remained frozen in time, bound by its laws, its breeding, its ghosts. It was a city out of step with the world, a monument to an idea that had turned to stone. And as the stars wheeled over the valley, as the flames of the torchlight ceremonies flickered against the marble of the temples, one could almost sense the gods watching, silent, uncertain whether to admire or to destroy. For in the hearts of the Spartans, the old divinities of love and chaos, Aphrodite, Dionysus, Eros, had been banished, replaced by something colder, a faith in control. And nothing angers the gods more than mortals who forget the need for balance. So the breeding rituals continued, beautiful and terrible, sacred and soulless. And beneath the perfection of their design, something ancient stirred, waiting for its moment to break through. The blood of Heracles might have founded Sparta, but even divine blood can curdle when it flows too long in the same vein. The seeds of decline had been sown, though no one yet dared name them. For now the city still marched, still sang, still bred. But in the distance, beyond the mountains, other nations watched, and waited for the day when the unbreakable would break. And when it came, it would not be through battle alone, but through the slow, inexorable collapse of the very system that had once made them great. The horror of their breeding would become their undoing, a silent, invisible death spreading through the veins of a people who had forgotten how to love. As the years passed, the perfection Sparta sought began to devour itself. What had once been a vision of divine strength was becoming a ghost that stalked its own people. The Spartan experiment, so proud in its purity, began to show cracks, not in the stone of its walls, but in the souls of its citizens. The city still stood, its warriors still trained, its laws still enforced, yet something invisible was dying. The air was heavy with discipline, but empty of spirit. What the gods had given, the passion of life, the chaos of love, the music of joy, had been silenced beneath the rhythm of marching feet. At night, in the quiet barracks where the young men slept on reeds, whispers began to circulate. Whispers of dreams, dreams of mothers' faces they barely remembered, of lovers they were forbidden to touch, of fields unscarred by war. Such dreams were shameful. They were signs of weakness, yet more and more of the youths confessed them in secret, as if the very soil of Laconia were breathing memories back into them. One boy, they said, claimed that Artemis herself had appeared to him, not as a goddess of war, but as a woman with tears in her eyes, asking why Sparta had turned birth into murder and love into law. He vanished the next day, taken by the ephors for re-education. His name was never spoken again. The women too began to feel the weight of the unending demand. They had been raised to glory in their strength, to see their wombs as instruments of destiny. But as the years wore on, many found their bodies breaking beneath the pressure. The constant expectation to bear sons, the judgment of the elders, the fear of failure, it hollowed them. The laughter of girls in the gymnasia grew quieter, replaced by the measured silence of endurance. The songs to Artemis, once proud and defiant, became laments in disguise. One legend tells of a woman named Eurylia, wife of a Spartan captain. For 10 years, she had given birth only to daughters. The elders demanded she try again, promising her husband another wife if she failed. On the eve of her next labor, she climbed the steps of the temple of Artemis Orthia, clutching a torch. There, in front of the statue of the goddess, she screamed into the night, "If strength is what you desire, take my body, but leave my soul." They found her body at dawn, the torch still burning beside her. Some said the goddess accepted her offering, others said it was defiance. But either way, after that night, the women of Sparta began lighting candles instead of torches during childbirth, small flames hidden in corners, prayers for the return of compassion. The men, bound by pride and silence, could not speak of their own exhaustion. They marched, they trained, they conquered, but inside they were haunted by the knowledge that they were no longer free. The laws that once made them strong had become chains. They belonged not to themselves, not to their families, but to a machine that could not stop, even when its purpose had been fulfilled. The elders called it virtue, the warriors called it duty. The priests spoke of strange signs, birds flying backward, rivers running red in the spring, children born without breath. The people called it divine anger. The elders called it superstition. But the unease could not be silenced. Sparta, once so certain of its destiny, began to question what destiny truly meant. Amid this silence of faith, stories began to emerge, half myth, half memory. Tales of the Helots, the enslaved people who toiled in the fields, whispering prayers to forgotten gods of fertility and harvest. The Helots believed that the land itself was rebelling, that the spirits of the infants cast off Taygetus were rising from the earth to reclaim what had been denied. And in their secret rituals, far from the watchful eyes of the ephors, they began to dance, slow, mournful dances under the moon, calling for the return of humanity to Sparta. Some Spartan women began to join them in secret. Cloaked and veiled, they slipped through the shadows to the outskirts of the city, where the slaves gathered. There, for the first time, they sang songs not of duty, but of sorrow and desire. In those forbidden gatherings, the wall between citizen and slave, between noble and outcast, blurred. The women discovered something long lost, the freedom to feel. And though these gatherings were dangerous, they spread. It was as if the city's repressed heart was beating again, faint but insistent. When the ephors discovered these rites, they called them heresy. Arrests were made, whips cracked in the public square. But the seed had been planted, and the people had tasted a truth stronger than fear, that perfection without compassion was a kind of death. The more the elders tried to suppress it, the more it grew, like grass pushing through stone. Meanwhile, the population continued to dwindle. The bloodlines were too few, too interwoven. Marriages that once strengthened the state now weakened it, producing fewer children each generation. The state, in its desperation, loosened its laws, permitting unions once forbidden, encouraging births by any means necessary. But the magic was gone. The spark that had once filled Spartan mothers with divine pride had turned to ash. The breeding rituals, once a symbol of power, had become grotesque parodies of themselves, ceremonies performed out of habit, empty of faith. And yet, the city refused to see the truth. They built new temples, erected new statues of Lycurgus and Heracles, hoping to rekindle the old fire. They proclaimed festivals celebrating the eternal strength of Sparta, but behind the marble and bronze, decay spread. Fewer boys entered the agoge. The black broth boiled for fewer mouths. The songs of marching soldiers grew thinner, echoed by ghosts. It was in this time that the legend of the silent birth arose. They said that one winter, when famine stalked the valley, a woman gave birth to a child that did not cry. The midwives examined him, perfect in form, strong in breath, but silent. When they held him to the light, he did not blink. When they whispered his name, he did not stir. The priests declared it an omen. The child was the mirror of Sparta itself, flawless, unfeeling, and doomed to stillness. The story spread, carried by travelers and soldiers, until it became a kind of prophecy. The day the child cries, they said, Sparta will weep as well. The ephors forbade the telling of that tale, but one cannot forbid a whisper. And soon the whisper turned into a voice. In the marketplace, in the barracks, even in the temples, the people began to question. If strength is all, they asked, why do we feel so weak? If we are the chosen, why do the gods not answer? If purity is our pride, why does our blood grow thin? The answers never came. And the elders, fearful of losing control, doubled their rituals, their punishments, their speeches. But it was too late. The spirit of rebellion had found a home, not in violence, but in memory. The memory of what it meant to be human. Some mothers began to defy the council quietly. They refused to surrender weak infants to the mountain. They hid them among the helots, who took them in as their own. These children grew up knowing both worlds, the iron of Sparta and the warmth of the earth. And though the city would never acknowledge them, their existence became a legend of its own, the ghost children of Taygetus. It was said they would one day return to reclaim what their ancestors had lost, not through war, but through compassion. The elders, blind in their certainty, continued to boast that Sparta's strength was eternal. But beneath their feet, the foundations trembled. The gods of love, banished for centuries, were returning, not as saviors but as reminders. The vines of Dionysus began creeping up temple walls. The altars of Artemis grew wild with flowers. Nature itself seemed to mock the city's obsession with control. In those final years of its purity, Sparta stood like a statue carved too perfectly, flawless, motionless, already cracking. The people still trained, still bred, still obeyed, but the spirit was gone. The rituals had become rituals of ghosts, reenacted by bodies that no longer believed. The experiment of eugenic perfection had reached its end, a beautiful corpse standing beneath the sun. And as the sun set over the Eurotas, casting long shadows across the empty fields, a chill wind rose from Taygetus. The same wind that had carried the cries of the abandoned infants centuries before. It whispered through the streets, through the temples, through the barracks. You have forgotten the purpose of life. You have made gods of your fears. And now your fears will consume you. Few heard it, fewer understood. But the silence that followed was the sound of an empire beginning to die. Not from enemies without, but from the void within. The sun over Laconia burned white and pitiless, bleaching the mountains until they seemed carved from bone. Beneath that sky, Sparta continued its relentless experiment. To outsiders it was a city of marble and spears, but within its walls it was more akin to a living organism, one that devoured weakness and exhaled strength. Every cry of a newborn, every sigh of a mother, every drop of sweat from a youth's brow was part of that organism's rhythm. The city beat like a heart trained to know only war. The ephors, those shadowed elders who interpreted the will of the gods and enforced the laws of Lycurgus, were the unseen surgeons of this great organism. They watched over every coupling, every birth, every whispered rumor of affection that might deviate from the state's purpose. Even love had to serve Sparta. Men and women were not individuals but ingredients in the recipe of endurance. The elders spoke often of the wolf, the totem beast of their people, for the wolf did not pair for tenderness but for survival. They said that when wolves bred, they chose the mate most likely to produce hunters. So must Sparta. Young men of noble bloodlines, honed through generations of selective mating, were often chosen for secret unions sanctioned by the state. These rituals, cloaked in darkness and superstition, were believed to invoke divine favor. Some took place not in temples, but in secluded groves of cypress, where the scent of resin mixed with sweat, and the chanting of priests mingled with the distant baying of hounds. The air there was thick with incense and fate. It was whispered that the priestesses of Artemis Orthia, goddess of the hunt and childbirth, presided over these ceremonies. They would smear the participants with oil mixed with the ashes of sacrificial animals, symbolic of purifying flesh through death, and then command them to join under the watchful eyes of the gods. To the modern ear, it sounds like a violation of intimacy, but to the Spartans it was sacred duty. The child born of such a union was not considered the offspring of the man or woman, but of the polis itself. The bloodlines were carefully traced, not for nobility of spirit, but for proven resilience. If a man had survived the agorge with distinction, if a woman came from a family of fertile, strong-bodied mothers, they were seen as worthy contributors to the state's human forge. The myths of the city reinforced this ideology. The poets sang of Heracles, the divine ancestor of the Spartans, who fathered countless sons across Hellas, each one a vessel of his strength. They said that the Heraclidae, the descendants of Heracles, had founded Sparta, and thus every Spartan was heir to his divine virility. The myth became law, and law became ritual. Men were urged to imitate the hero not only in courage, but in the act of propagation. Women were told that to bear children was the highest form of heroism, equal to a man's valor in battle. Death in childbirth was praised as death on the field of war. Even marriage itself was stripped of sentiment and shaped by Spartan logic. A bride's head would be shaved on the eve of her wedding, her clothing replaced by a man's cloak. She waited in darkness until her husband came secretly in the night. This custom, some said, was to ease the transition from bachelor comradeship to conjugal life. Others whispered that it symbolized conquest, the man seizing his bride as he would seize an enemy city. Yet beneath these interpretations lay a deeper current, the attempt to train desire, to make even love a form of discipline. The couple were not permitted to live together at once. The man continued to dwell in his barracks, visiting his wife in secrecy until the state deemed it proper for them to cohabit. Passion was thus turned into a kind of military exercise, regulated, rationed, purposeful. The result of these unions were children bred not for comfort, but for endurance. The Spartans viewed birth not as the creation of life, but as the testing of nature. At dawn, when a child was born, it was taken from the mother's arms and presented before the council of elders. They examined it coldly, its limbs, its cries, its skin. If the infant seemed frail or deformed, it was declared unfit. The elders did not use the word murder. They said the child was being returned to the earth from which it came, that the gods would receive it again. Some were abandoned at Mount Taygetus, others left by the river's edge. The act was not done with cruelty, they believed, but with reverence for purity. It was said that those left to die became spirits who guarded the mountains, their voices carried in the winds that howled through the ravines. In this grim selection, the Spartans saw justice. They compared themselves to smiths forging blades, every flaw removed, every imperfection cast aside. To allow the weak to live, they thought, was to corrupt the entire city, and yet there were murmurs even among them, quiet doubts whispered by mothers at night when no one could hear. Some claimed that Artemis herself wept for the lost infants, that she sent omens, storms, stillbirths, or strange cries in the forests as punishment for such coldness. But no Spartan dared to defy the law openly. Pity was a foreign language to them. As generations passed, these breeding customs took on the sheen of sacredness. They became myths in themselves, retold by old men at the Syssitia feasts, tales of how the first kings of Sparta had struck a covenant with the gods to keep the bloodline pure. They said the twin founders, Eurysthenes and Procles, were born from a divine union, sanctioned by Apollo, who promised that their descendants would rule so long as the blood remained untainted. To question the system was to question the gods. Thus, myth fortified cruelty, and cruelty gave birth to a kind of holiness. Women in Sparta bore this burden with paradoxical pride. Unlike in other Greek cities, they were given freedom of movement, education, and the expectation of physical excellence. They trained alongside the men, raced, wrestled, and sang hymns to the goddess of childbirth. But this empowerment was not for their own sake, it was for the sake of stronger children. A Spartan mother was praised not for beauty or grace, but for her hips, her stamina, her ability to bear sons who could endure the agoge. Some foreign visitors mistook this for liberation, but in truth, it was another form of servitude, a sacred slavery to the state's dream of perfection. At festivals, these ideals were dramatized. During the Hyacinthia, the young girls danced in circles, their bodies glistening in the sun, their movements echoing the rhythm of creation and destruction. The boys watched from the colonnades, their eyes hungry not with lust, but with ambition. Pairings were sometimes decided in the aftermath of these rituals, not through affection, but through divine casting, as if the gods themselves pointed out which womb should receive which seed. Priests read omens in the smoke of burnt offerings, declaring unions favorable or doomed. When two were chosen, they were said to be bound not by love, but by destiny. In such a world, the line between religion and biology vanished. The act of conception was an offering. The body was a temple of the state. Even when the city declined in later centuries, when foreign envoys and philosophers began to sneer at Spartan austerity, these rituals endured in memory. They were spoken of with a mixture of awe and horror, a people who had tried to command nature itself, who had turned reproduction into warfare. Yet not all the tales were grim. There were legends of forbidden loves that defied the system. One spoke of a young warrior who fell in love with a helot woman, a serf forbidden to bear Spartan blood. When she bore his child, the ephors ordered both to be executed. But on the night of their capture, a storm tore through the valley, and they vanished. The people whispered that Artemis had transformed them into wolves, allowing them to live free in the forests, hunting together until the end of time. The myth lingered as a faint rebellion, proof that even in Sparta, the heart sometimes rose against the law. But the system prevailed, decade after decade, century after century. As the boys grew into men and the girls into mothers, the city's pulse remained steady. The children of those dark unions marched in phalanx formation, shields locked, faces impassive. They were the living proof of their society's breeding experiment. Each step they took across the battlefield was a rhythm in the heartbeat of the state. The world called them monsters, yet to themselves they were holy. Every death in war was another seed sown into the soil of eternity, for the Spartans believed that through death they fertilized the future, that from their blood would spring sons stronger than they. Still, even Sparta could not defy time. As the centuries rolled on, the population dwindled. The very purity they sought became their curse. Too few children survived. Too many lines died out. By the age of the later kings, desperate measures were taken. Men were permitted, even encouraged, to father children with other men's wives if the pairing promised robust offspring. Husbands lent their wives as one might lend a stallion, all in the name of the city. The private and the sacred blurred completely. Fertility became strategy, and the bedchamber became another battlefield. Foreigners recoiled at these customs. Philosophers like Aristotle called them unnatural, warning that the obsession with purity would lead to ruin. But the Spartans listened only to the echo of their ancestors. They believed the soul of Lycurgus still walked the mountains, watching, judging, commanding them to remain pure. And so they obeyed, even as their numbers shrank, even as the once mighty phalanxes thinned to lines of ghosts. In the hush of twilight, when the last light touched the peaks of Taygetus, the women of Sparta would stand on their rooftops and call out to their sons at training, their voices rising like a chorus of fate. They sang not lullabies, but songs of endurance, songs that reminded each child of the price of being born Spartan. It was said that even the winds paused to listen, carrying their cries across the valleys like a haunting prayer. In that sound lived the soul of the city, fierce, disciplined, and tragic. And so the ritual continued, endless and unrelenting. From coupling to birth, from cradle to grave, every Spartan life was a single thread in a tapestry woven from blood and belief. The city itself was the weaver, blind and merciless, yet magnificent in its vision. As night descended and torches flickered against the marble, the air seemed to tremble with the weight of their purpose, a purpose born of fear, faith, and the unyielding dream of perfection. As the years passed, the perfection Sparta sought began to devour itself. What had once been a vision of divine strength was becoming a ghost that stalked its own people. The Spartan experiment, so proud in its purity, began to show cracks, not in the stone of its walls, but in the souls of its citizens. The city still stood, its warriors still trained, its laws still enforced, yet something invisible was dying. The air was heavy with discipline, but empty of spirit. What the gods had given, the passion of life, the chaos of love, the music of joy, had been silenced beneath the rhythm of marching feet. At night, in the quiet barracks where the young men slept on reeds, whispers began to circulate. Whispers of dreams, dreams of mothers' faces they barely remembered, of lovers they were forbidden to touch, of fields unscarred by war. Such dreams were shameful. They were signs of weakness, yet more and more of the youths confessed them in secret, as if the very soil of Laconia were breathing memories back into them. One boy, they said, claimed that Artemis herself had appeared to him, not as a goddess of war, but as a woman with tears in her eyes, asking why Sparta had turned birth into murder and love into law. He vanished the next day, taken by the ephors for re-education. His name was never spoken again. The women too began to feel the weight of the unending demand. They had been raised to glory in their strength, to see their wombs as instruments of destiny. But as the years wore on, many found their bodies breaking beneath the pressure. The constant expectation to bear sons, the judgment of the elders, the fear of failure, it hollowed them. The laughter of girls in the gymnasia grew quieter, replaced by the measured silence of endurance. The songs to Artemis, once proud and defiant, became laments in disguise. One legend tells of a woman named Eurylia, wife of a Spartan captain. For 10 years, she had given birth only to daughters. The elders demanded she try again, promising her husband another wife if she failed. On the eve of her next labor, she climbed the steps of the temple of Artemis Orthia, clutching a torch. There, in front of the statue of the goddess, she screamed into the night, "If strength is what you desire, take my body, but leave my soul." They found her body at dawn, the torch still burning beside her. Some said the goddess accepted her offering, others said it was defiance. But either way, after that night, the women of Sparta began lighting candles instead of torches during childbirth, small flames hidden in corners, prayers for the return of compassion. The men, bound by pride and silence, could not speak of their own exhaustion. They marched, they trained, they conquered, but inside they were haunted by the knowledge that they were no longer free. The laws that once made them strong had become chains. They belonged not to themselves, not to their families, but to a machine that could not stop, even when its purpose had been fulfilled. The elders called it virtue, the warriors called it duty. The priests spoke of strange signs, birds flying backward, rivers running red in the spring, children born without breath. The people called it divine anger. The elders called it superstition. But the unease could not be silenced. Sparta, once so certain of its destiny, began to question what destiny truly meant. Amid this silence of faith, stories began to emerge, half myth, half memory. Tales of the Helots, the enslaved people who toiled in the fields, whispering prayers to forgotten gods of fertility and harvest. The Helots believed that the land itself was rebelling, that the spirits of the infants cast off Taygetus were rising from the earth to reclaim what had been denied. And in their secret rituals, far from the watchful eyes of the ephors, they began to dance, slow, mournful dances under the moon, calling for the return of humanity to Sparta. Some Spartan women began to join them in secret. Cloaked and veiled, they slipped through the shadows to the outskirts of the city, where the slaves gathered. There, for the first time, they sang songs not of duty, but of sorrow and desire. In those forbidden gatherings, the wall between citizen and slave, between noble and outcast, blurred. The women discovered something long lost, the freedom to feel. And though these gatherings were dangerous, they spread. It was as if the city's repressed heart was beating again, faint but insistent. When the ephors discovered these rites, they called them heresy. Arrests were made, whips cracked in the public square. But the seed had been planted, and the people had tasted a truth stronger than fear, that perfection without compassion was a kind of death. The more the elders tried to suppress it, the more it grew, like grass pushing through stone. Meanwhile, the population continued to dwindle. The bloodlines were too few, too interwoven. Marriages that once strengthened the state now weakened it, producing fewer children each generation. The state, in its desperation, loosened its laws, permitting unions once forbidden, encouraging births by any means necessary. But the magic was gone. The spark that had once filled Spartan mothers with divine pride had turned to ash. The breeding rituals, once a symbol of power, had become grotesque parodies of themselves, ceremonies performed out of habit, empty of faith. And yet, the city refused to see the truth. They built new temples, erected new statues of Lycurgus and Heracles, hoping to rekindle the old fire. They proclaimed festivals celebrating the eternal strength of Sparta, but behind the marble and bronze, decay spread. Fewer boys entered the agoge. The black broth boiled for fewer mouths. The songs of marching soldiers grew thinner, echoed by ghosts. It was in this time that the legend of the silent birth arose. They said that one winter, when famine stalked the valley, a woman gave birth to a child that did not cry. The midwives examined him, perfect in form, strong in breath, but silent. When they held him to the light, he did not blink. When they whispered his name, he did not stir. The priests declared it an omen. The child was the mirror of Sparta itself, flawless, unfeeling, and doomed to stillness. The story spread, carried by travelers and soldiers, until it became a kind of prophecy. The day the child cries, they said, Sparta will weep as well. The ephors forbade the telling of that tale, but one cannot forbid a whisper. And soon the whisper turned into a voice. In the marketplace, in the barracks, even in the temples, the people began to question. If strength is all, they asked, why do we feel so weak? If we are the chosen, why do the gods not answer? If purity is our pride, why does our blood grow thin? The answers never came, and the elders, fearful of losing control, doubled their rituals, their punishments, their speeches. But it was too late. The spirit of rebellion had found a home, not in violence, but in memory. The memory of what it meant to be human. Some mothers began to defy the council quietly. They refused to surrender weak infants to the mountain. They hid them among the helots, who took them in as their own. These children grew up knowing both worlds, the iron of Sparta and the warmth of the earth. And though the city would never acknowledge them, their existence became a legend of its own, the ghost children of Taygetus. It was said they would one day return to reclaim what their ancestors had lost, not through war, but through compassion. The elders, blind in their certainty, continued to boast that Sparta's strength was eternal. But beneath their feet, the foundations trembled. The gods of love, banished for centuries, were returning, not as saviors but as reminders. The vines of Dionysus began creeping up temple walls. The altars of Artemis grew wild with flowers. Nature itself seemed to mock the city's obsession with control. In those final years of its purity, Sparta stood like a statue carved too perfectly, flawless, motionless, already cracking. The people still trained, still bred, still obeyed, but the spirit was gone. The rituals had become rituals of ghosts, reenacted by bodies that no longer believed. The experiment of eugenic perfection had reached its end, a beautiful corpse standing beneath the sun. And as the sun set over the Eurotas, casting long shadows across the empty fields, a chill wind rose from Taygetus. The same wind that had carried the cries of the abandoned infants centuries before. It whispered through the streets, through the temples, through the barracks. You have forgotten the purpose of life. You have made gods of your fears, and now your fears will consume you. Few heard it, fewer understood, but the silence that followed was the sound of an empire beginning to die. Not from enemies without, but from the void within. The wind howled down from Taygetus, carrying the faint, impossible cry of a child long gone. The women at the temple of Artemis Orthia paused, torches trembling in their hands. For a moment, the boundary between past and present seemed to vanish. The abandoned infants of the mountains, the silent births, the discarded souls of generations, all seemed to converge in that single wail. The priestesses crossed themselves, whispering prayers in low, trembling tones. Even in Sparta, the city of discipline and perfection, there were moments when fear could not be silenced. The ephors, cloistered in their marble chambers, were oblivious to the sound. They continued to administer the city with the rigid logic that had governed it for centuries. Laws were enforced with brutal efficiency. Every birth, every death, every marriage remained catalogued and scrutinized. Yet something was slipping through the cracks. The numbers of children who survived into adulthood were dwindling. Even the strongest youths, honed by decades of selective breeding, were fewer with each passing year. Sparta, the unyielding, had begun to wither. The women who had gathered at the temple whispered among themselves in a voice so soft it seemed the mountains themselves might carry it. They spoke of omens, Strange storms that tore across the valley, cattle falling mysteriously ill, rivers running dark with mud and leaves. The priests called it a test from the gods, yet the whispers carried a different tone. Doubt. Perhaps Artemis had withdrawn her favor, perhaps Apollo no longer spoke through oracles. The city had believed itself immortal, but immortality had always been a dangerous illusion. In the streets, the effects of decay were visible. Soldiers marched in tight phalanxes, yet their numbers were thinner than they had been a generation prior. Where once Sparta could field thousands of warriors, now battalions seemed skeletal, disciplined but hollow. Markets were quieter. The laughter of children, once a background hum to the city's heartbeat, had become rare. Families that had once produced line after line of warriors now struggled to produce even a single male heir. The rituals continued. Marriages sanctioned by the ephors, ceremonies at temples, hymns to Artemis, but their purpose had grown ceremonial rather than vital. The city moved through motions, a grand theater with no audience beyond itself. And yet, myth clung to life, even in decay. Stories circulated that the rejected infants had not perished, but had risen in the mountains as spirits, observing the city, judging its pride, and waiting for a reckoning. Travelers from far lands told tales of strange figures glimpsed in the high passes, pale, silent, their eyes unblinking. Shepherds whispered of unseen hands, leading lost animals back to safety, only to vanish before dawn. The stories spread, merging history and legend until they were inseparable. The city itself was becoming a character in its own myth, a once mighty organism now haunted by the ghosts of its own creation. The priestesses sought to respond. They intensified their rituals, burning incense in heavier clouds, smearing oil and herbs over their bodies in frantic devotion, performing rites that had once been sufficient but now felt hollow. The young women were drilled not only in physical endurance, but in ceremonial precision, taught that each gesture, each song was a thread holding the city together. Yet even the strongest could sense the emptiness. The connection between sacrifice and favor, between obedience and divine blessing, had frayed. The rituals became frantic, almost desperate. Torchlight flickered over marble walls, casting shadows that moved like restless spirits. It was during one of these nights that a new legend arose. A woman, known only as Myrto, had given birth to twins, both perfect in body and vigor. But unlike previous children, they cried not with life, but with the echo of the city's sins. Their wails carried across the rooftops, across the barracks, and into the temples. The priestesses, horrified, consulted the ephors. The elders declared it an omen, a warning that Sparta's obsession with perfection had gone too far, that the city had made gods of itself, and that the gods would not be mocked forever. Myrto's children were taken to Mount Taygetus, not abandoned but left in a secluded cave, where it was said the spirits of the discarded would greet them. Some whispered that the twins survived, raised by shadows and the winds themselves, their eyes filled with knowledge that mortals should not possess. In the barracks, the young men sensed the shift as well. Their training continued, but an unease crept in beneath the rhythm of drills and marches. They felt it in the silence between commands, in the echo of their own footsteps across empty streets, in the shadow of the mountains that had witnessed centuries of sacrifice. Dreams grew vivid, filled with the cries of infants, the gaze of mothers, and the quiet accusation of the gods. Some woke screaming, only to be met with cold discipline rather than comfort. The city's strength was intact, but its spirit, the invisible force that had driven Sparta to legend, was fraying. The decay extended beyond the human. Even the land seemed to revolt. Crops failed in odd patterns, the Eurotas ran sluggish and brown, the herds grew thinner, and the helots, sensing the city's waning power, became restless. Small uprisings, once unthinkable, began to occur. These revolts were suppressed, but they carried a warning that the city could no longer ignore. Sparta's obsession with bloodlines and ritual had produced warriors, yes, but also a brittle society, incapable of adapting beyond the iron laws of Lycurgus. As the decades wore on, the ephors grew paranoid. They mandated even stricter enforcement of breeding rituals, pairing families with little regard for affection or consent, insisting that every child, every union, be a deliberate calculation in the city's survival. And yet, the results were inconsistent. Even the strongest unions sometimes failed, the infants born weak or ill. Fertility, once a symbol of divine favor, had become capricious. The priests interpreted each failure as a test. The citizens whispered of divine abandonment. The city's pulse, once steady and unyielding, began to falter. Legends grew darker to fill the void left by reason. It was said that the gods, angered by Sparta's hubris, had sent a great spirit to watch over the abandoned children, a force that whispered vengeance in the mountains. Travelers spoke of a phantom army, spectral infants marching in the mist, their cries carried by the wind to haunt the city's rulers. Mothers who had lost children in Mount Taygetus reported seeing their ghosts in dreams, guiding the living with impossible knowledge, demanding remembrance. These stories, though frightening, were embraced by the people. For even in myth, there was a reminder of the city's humanity, a trace of empathy Sparta had long tried to suppress. Meanwhile, the rituals of the women became even more elaborate. Each year, the priestesses instructed them to move through long, silent processions, tracing the paths their mothers and grandmothers had taken, reciting hymns that described the trials of fertility and endurance. They offered food and drink to the mountain spirits, placed amulets on the riverbanks, and painted symbols of strength on their bodies. To the uninitiated, these acts seemed archaic or even superstitious. To the participants, they were acts of defiance as much as devotion, a fragile assertion of life within the rigid structure imposed by the city. The younger generation began to question more openly. Boys who had once been proud of their lineage wondered if the cost of perfection had been too high. Girls who had been trained to see their wombs as sacred instruments began to fear the altar rather than respect it. The tension between duty and fear became almost unbearable. Even as the ephors imposed ever greater rigor, the city's vitality diminished. Sparta, the city of the unbreakable, was slowly cracking under its own weight. And in the darkness of night, when torches guttered and shadows lengthened, the city could almost hear the verdict of the gods. Not in thunder or lightning, but in the quiet lament of wind through the mountains, in the whisper of leaves along the Eurotas, in the distant cry of infants who had never lived. The divine silence was louder than any voice, more terrifying than any army. It was a reminder that no law, no ritual, no discipline could command nature or the gods forever. Thus, Sparta entered the final chapters of its legend not with a battle cry, but with a quiet, persistent decay. Its walls remained, its phalanxes marched, its rituals endured, yet its heart faltered. The city had tried to make itself immortal, but in doing so, it had angered the balance of life. The gods, patient and inscrutable, observed in silence, and the ghosts of the mountains waited, carrying the echoes of every discarded child, every broken mother, every failed union. The city that had once molded itself into the image of divine perfection was now a hollow echo of its ambition, beautiful and terrible, proud and doomed. The dawn rose over Taygetus, pale and hesitant, as if the mountains themselves feared to illuminate the city below. Sparta stirred, but it was a quiet, deliberate motion, a city moving by memory rather than vitality. The soldiers marched in silence, their shields locked, their eyes empty of the fire that had once burned so fiercely. The women, torchlight fading, returned from the temple rituals, their faces pale, their hands stiff with the weight of expectation. The air smelled of ash, incense, and the lingering ghost of sweat and blood. Time in Sparta seemed to have slowed, measured not by the sun, but by the unyielding rhythm of duty and repetition. Even the gods appeared to have turned away. The temples were intact. Statues of Artemis and Apollo stood undisturbed, yet the altars were silent. Sacrifices were offered, prayers whispered, but no sign answered the devotions. The priests muttered about tests of faith. The ephors insisted that devotion must be renewed, yet doubt had begun to seep into the hearts of all. What was once a city under divine favor now felt as though it existed in a liminal space, suspended between myth and decay, between the living and the dead. The decline of Sparta was not sudden, nor violent in the traditional sense. There were no invading armies, no great battles that razed walls and toppled columns. Its enemies, external and internal, were subtler: disease, infertility, the slow attrition of numbers, and the unseen pressure of expectation that had become a cage. The children who survived were fewer, their bodies strong but their spirits wary, carrying in their silent gazes the weight of generations of sacrifice. They were living monuments to a system that demanded perfection at the cost of compassion, a system that had begun to consume itself. Legends tell of a time when the city's oracle, deep in trance, proclaimed a vision of the end. She spoke of a mountain river swollen with tears, of infants walking silently through the streets, of women whose eyes had lost their fire. She claimed that the gods would return to reclaim what Sparta had taken from them, and that the city's glory would fade like smoke. The ephors dismissed this as hysteria, yet the tale spread, carried by merchants and travelers, whispered in the shadows of the agora. The story became a prophecy, merging with memory, until the boundary between history and myth was impossible to discern. The Helots, long the oppressed laborers of the land, watched with wary eyes. They had always whispered of the mountain's ghosts and the spirits of abandoned children. But now those whispers carried new conviction. Small acts of rebellion, once isolated, became coordinated in subtle, almost invisible ways. Crops poisoned, livestock led astray, tools hidden or broken. The city's vigilance, once unbreakable, strained under the weight of its declining population and the growing unrest. The sense that the land itself might be conspiring against them crept into every household, every barracks, every temple precinct. Among the citizens, tales of the past became warnings. Mothers spoke of discarded infants who had survived against impossible odds, raised by shadow and wind in the mountains. They told of these children returning in visions, teaching lessons in courage and mercy that the city had long forgotten. In hushed tones, parents admitted fear that their own sons might one day vanish, claimed by the same forces that had taken their ancestors. The past was no longer a series of events, but a living presence, shaping behavior, haunting decisions, and reminding all of the cost of hubris. Even the men who had survived the rigorous training of the agoge began to question its meaning. They had endured years of hardship, forged in physical and mental discipline, yet the results felt hollow. The victories they achieved in battle, the accolades received from the ephors, the loyalty of comrades, all were fragments of a legacy whose true purpose seemed increasingly opaque. The drills, the formations, the speeches, the rituals, they were no longer conduits to greatness, but echoes of a perfection that the world no longer recognized. Women too sensed the change in the city's rhythm. They continued to bear children, trained their daughters and sons in the arts of endurance, yet their faith in the system was strained. They whispered prayers not for the strength of the city, but for its survival, for the souls of the abandoned, for a mercy the laws refused to grant. In secret, some began to care for the weak and ill, hiding infants who might otherwise have been left to die, teaching them songs and stories of the world beyond the city's iron laws. These acts were quiet, almost invisible, yet they carried the seed of rebellion. The notion that compassion, rather than perfection, might be a measure of true strength. Myths took on new forms during this period of decline. Stories spread of the mountain spirits, of the silent infants who roamed the peaks, and of divine beings who judged Sparta's obsession with control. The gods themselves, long invoked in ceremonies and sacrifices, were now cast as witnesses to cruelty rather than benefactors. Artemis, once the guardian of mothers and birth, became in legend a silent observer, her eyes fixed on the city that had distorted her gift. Apollo, whose prophecies had guided generations, was imagined to turn away, shaking his head at the arrogance of men who believed they could command life itself. These myths were retold with growing urgency, a reflection of the unease that even the most disciplined citizens could not suppress. The final decades of Sparta's prominence were marked by a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of authority. The Ephors, once feared and respected without question, began to wield power through intimidation rather than reverence. Decisions were enforced with increasing severity, yet compliance waned. Soldiers drilled mechanically, children learned lessons by rote, and mothers followed rituals that had lost their sacred resonance. The city's pulse continued, but it was faint, strained, like a river forced through narrowing channels. Even the walls which had withstood centuries of war seemed hollowed by time and neglect. In these years, the stories of extraordinary children, twins born with prescient awareness, infants who survived abandonment, became symbols of hope and warning. They were reminders that life, even under the harshest constraints, could assert itself in unexpected ways. They embodied the tension between Sparta's laws and the natural order, between human ambition and divine will. Tales of these children traveled beyond Laconia, carried by wandering poets and merchants, becoming part of the collective memory of Greece. The moral of these legends was clear: the pursuit of perfection without compassion breeds fragility. Sparta had attempted to master nature, to sculpt human beings into instruments of the state, to convert motherhood and warfare into tools of destiny. And yet, in doing so, it had sown the seeds of its own decline. The city's obsession with strength and lineage had created warriors, yes, but also hollow citizens, fearful mothers, and restless spirits. Its laws, once a source of order, had become chains that bound both body and soul. Even as the city dwindled, the myths persisted, growing more elaborate, more cautionary. The mountains whispered of infants who had survived, of mothers who had defied ritual, of gods who had observed and waited. Tales of divine retribution intertwined with the historical record, creating a narrative that was part legend, part warning. To outsiders, Sparta became a symbol of both awe and horror, a civilization that had reached for the divine and, in its hubris, had nearly destroyed itself. By the end of its prominence, Sparta had become a city of ghosts and shadows. Its armies were fewer, its rituals more desperate, its people haunted by the memory of generations sacrificed in the pursuit of perfection. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the wind moved through the Eurotas and the mountains beyond, the city's legacy persisted. It was a cautionary tale, a mythic echo, a reminder that ambition, unchecked by compassion, can consume even the mightiest of civilizations. The torches of the last ritual burned low as the women returned to their homes, their faces reflecting both pride and sorrow. The soldiers, lined along the agora, lowered their spears with a weight that seemed heavier than the iron itself. Even the ephors, in their marble halls, felt the subtle tremor of a city aware of its own mortality. And in the mountains where infants had once been abandoned, the wind carried a sound, faint, distant human, as though the spirits of the discarded were whispering that Sparta, for all its glory, had never truly been immortal. The city's fall would not be sudden. It would not come in fire or blood alone. It would arrive slowly, in quiet erosion, in the weakening of numbers, in the fading of belief. in the subtle recognition that the cost of perfection is always greater than one imagines. And as the sun set over Taygetus, casting long shadows across the marble and stone, the city that had once sought to command life itself stood as a silent monument, magnificent, tragic, and finally human. The ruins of Sparta, though still standing in part, were quiet now, their stones weathered by centuries of sun, wind, and the slow passage of human memory. Travelers from distant lands spoke of columns half buried in dust, of walls cracked and hollow, of the faint echoes of voices that seemed to linger in empty courtyards. To the untrained eye, it was merely a city fallen to time. But to those who remembered the stories, who had heard the whispered accounts of priests, mothers, and soldiers, Sparta was more than stone and dust. It was a monument to obsession, to human ambition, and to the fragile line between strength and ruin. Even as the city declined, its memory grew. Poets, philosophers, and historians carried tales of the Spartan way far beyond Laconia. They spoke of a people who had attempted to bend life itself to the will of law, who had sought to impose perfection upon the chaos of birth and growth. Some admired Sparta's discipline, its courage, its unyielding spirit. Others shuddered at the cold logic that had governed its laws, at the ruthless sacrifices demanded of mothers and children alike. To outsiders, Sparta became both legend and warning, a civilization that had danced too close to the edge of human possibility and had paid the price. The myth of divine oversight persisted. In the centuries that followed, travelers told of strange shadows moving through the mountains of Taygetus, of whispers carried by wind across the Eurotas valley. Some claimed that the spirits of discarded children, those abandoned in ritual, still roamed the high passes, watching over the land, whispering warnings, or guiding those who sought to walk the path of courage and endurance. Mothers in other cities used these stories as cautionary tales, teaching their children about the cost of hubris and the perils of demanding too much of human life. Sparta's obsession with breeding and purity became a central topic in the chronicles of later Greek thinkers. Aristotle, in his writings, condemned the city's rigid social order, noting that the pursuit of strength and uniformity had come at the expense of compassion and natural growth. Yet even he admitted that Sparta had created warriors unmatched in courage, citizens disciplined beyond measure, and a society that, for centuries, had defended its borders against countless enemies. In this duality lay the city's enduring fascination, a civilization that combined awe-inspiring order with haunting cruelty that elevated human potential even as it punished imperfection. Stories of Spartan mothers and their children continued to circulate, growing more elaborate with each telling. One tale spoke of a woman who had hidden her weak-born child, feeding him in secret and teaching him the songs of the old rituals. The boy grew into a warrior unlike any other, neither strongest nor fastest, but clever and resilient, capable of navigating the chaos that Sparta had long sought to suppress. Legends framed these exceptions as proof that the divine had not abandoned human life entirely, that even in a city ruled by law and blood, the spirit of compassion could find its way. The phalanx, once the symbol of Spartan dominance, became in myth a symbol of fragility. Tales of battles once recounted in terms of strategy and victory began to emphasize the human cost. The sons who never returned the families left empty-handed, the mothers who had given everything and gained nothing but the memory of endurance. Even victory was bittersweet, for each triumph carried the ghost of sacrifice, the shadow of a child discarded, or a mother hardened by necessity. The legacy of Sparta was therefore not only in stone, blood, and weaponry, but in the collective memory of what was gained and what was lost. The European imagination carried Sparta forward into centuries of reflection and reinterpretation. Roman writers, fascinated by the city's discipline and moral rigor, debated its methods and ethics. Some, like Plutarch, told stories of Spartan courage, alongside accounts of its ruthlessness, presenting the city as an enigma, a people who had revered law above love, strength above tenderness, and duty above all else. Even as Rome itself rose, the tales of abandoned children, secret rites, and the relentless pursuit of perfection cast a long shadow over the minds of philosophers and generals. Sparta became a mirror, reflecting both admiration and warning, a civilization that had reached for the divine and suffered for it. In later centuries, travelers and scholars speculated endlessly about the truth behind Sparta's rituals. Were the abandoned children truly left to die? Were the secret ceremonies of women as elaborate and terrifying as the myths suggested? Did the ephors wield their power with the cold logic remembered by chroniclers, or had compassion occasionally tempered law in secret? The answers were obscured by time, by the blending of fact and legend. What remained was the impression of a city that had tried to command life itself, and in doing so had etched its story into the annals of human imagination. The mountains of Taygetus continued to bear witness. The peaks, once the sites of abandoned infants and whispered prayers, stood silent, eternal. Streams that had carried offerings to the gods flowed steadily, indifferent to human ambition. The wind moved through the forests, as it had for centuries, carrying the faint echoes of the past, cries, chants, songs, and the rhythm of countless lives shaped and constrained by the laws of the city. Nature endured, patient and unyielding, reminding those who remembered that human designs are fleeting, while the earth remains. Yet even in ruin, Sparta's lessons endured. The city's obsession with strength, discipline, and perfection became an archetype in literature and philosophy. Its rituals, though horrifying in detail, were remembered not merely as cruelty, but as testament to the extremes to which a civilization might go in pursuit of a vision. The mythic children, the spectral mothers, the silent winds over the mountains, all became symbols of the tension between ambition and humanity, between law and compassion, between mortality and the desire for eternity. In the quiet of evening, when shadows stretched across the ruins and the last light touched marble columns, one could almost hear the echoes of Sparta's heartbeat. Not the thundering pulse of its armies, nor the rhythmic discipline of its soldiers, but a faint trembling reminder of the city's soul, a combination of fear and courage, of duty and sorrow, of triumph and loss. It was a sound impossible to measure, yet impossible to forget. The lingering resonance of a civilization that had sought perfection and discovered the fragility of life. The moral of Sparta's story was thus both grim and profound. It was a civilization that had reached toward divinity, attempting to master birth, life, and strength through law and ritual. In doing so, it had created both greatness and tragedy, resilience and decay, myth and horror. To admire Sparta was to recognize the heights human order can achieve. To study its decline was to confront the consequences of demanding too much of the living. The city, in life and legend, embodied the eternal tension between ambition and humility, between the mortal and the divine. Even today, the echoes of Sparta persist. Scholars trace the lineage of its influence in military strategy, in educational philosophy, in cultural ideals of courage and discipline. Yet the stories of its rituals, its abandoned children, and its relentless pursuit of perfection serve as warnings, reminders that obsession, no matter how disciplined or rationalized, carries a cost. The city's shadow stretches across centuries, a haunting example of human ambition entwined with moral and spiritual consequence. And so, in the silence that settles over Taygetus, where wind and stone converse in the language of time, the memory of Sparta endures. Its mothers, its soldiers, its children, its laws, and its rituals all remain as part of a narrative both historical and mythic, tangible and spectral. For those who listen, it is a story that speaks to the dangers of control, the weight of duty, the value of compassion, and the inexorable passage of time. The city that had sought to mold perfection now exists as a legend, a caution, and a testament to the enduring complexity of the human spirit. In the end, Sparta's greatest legacy is not the stone of its walls or the names of its kings, but the story itself, a tale of ambition and sorrow, of divine aspiration and human limitation, of a civilization that reached for immortality and found instead the fragile and haunting truth of mortality. And in that story lies a question that echoes across the ages. What price truly is too high to pay for perfection? The sun had long dipped behind Taygetus, casting the city in shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. Sparta no longer thrived as it once had. The bustling streets and echoing barracks were gone, replaced by empty courtyards, silent temples, and stones cracked with age. Yet in this silence, the city spoke in ways more profound than any voice could carry. It whispered stories of ambition and obsession, of mothers and children, of gods and men intertwined in a relentless pursuit of perfection. The stones themselves seemed to hum with memory, carrying the weight of generations that had been molded, tested, and often discarded. Those who came later, travelers, scholars, poets, sensed that the city was more than ruins. They felt the presence of something that had endured despite time and decay. Some called it the spirit of Sparta. Others saw it as the echo of countless lives shaped by law, discipline, and ritual. In every shadowed alley, every cracked column, every hollow temple, there lingered the question of what it had truly cost to create the Spartan ideal. Was it courage, loyalty, and strength, or was it something darker? The soft murmur of humanity lost beneath the iron weight of expectation. The legends of the abandoned children persisted, woven into the very identity of the city. Mothers had once left infants on Taygetus in the belief that only the strongest should survive, only the fittest should inherit life. Yet later storytellers imagined that those children, touched by mountain winds and divine oversight, had survived in secret, rising to carry the wisdom, grief, and resilience of generations. They became symbols not only of what Sparta demanded, but of what it could not control. The unpredictable resilience of life, the persistence of spirit against even the strictest design. These stories blurred the line between history and myth. Ancient chroniclers recorded births and deaths with meticulous care, noting the outcomes of breeding rituals and military campaigns alike. Later poets and philosophers dramatized them, filling in gaps with imagination, fear, and wonder. The mountains of Laconia became a character in themselves, a witness to both glory and cruelty, a silent arbiter of the city's moral and spiritual accounting. Even today, modern visitors feel a chill when standing among the ruins, as if the mountains are still listening, still remembering, still judging. The moral of Sparta's story emerges not in the sharp clang of shields, nor in the disciplined march of phalanxes, but in the quiet spaces between, in the mother's whispered prayers, the children's cries that were sometimes heard and sometimes imagined, the winds that sweep across the Eurotas carrying secrets of the past. Sparta's obsession with control, with perfection, and with divine favor created a society both extraordinary and fragile. It elevated human potential to heights rarely seen in the ancient world. Yet it also exacted a cost measured not in coins or territory, but in the lives and spirits of countless individuals. Even the laws of Lycurgus, which had governed so much of Spartan life, take on a different meaning in hindsight. They were brilliant in their logic, yet rigid beyond compassion. Every child measured, every marriage arranged, every ritual enforced. All were intended to produce strength, Yet in doing so, they eroded the softer, more human aspects of life. Discipline without empathy, the city learned, could only sustain itself for so long. Myth and legend immortalized the discipline, yet history recorded the consequences. The duality became Sparta's enduring lesson. Greatness and cruelty are often inseparable, and the pursuit of one may demand the other. In reflecting on the city's past, the role of the women emerges as especially profound. They bore the brunt of Spartan society's demands, yet within those constraints they exercised agency in ways often overlooked. Mothers and priestesses navigated a world dictated by law and ritual, channeling power, secrecy, and endurance in forms that were subtle but potent. Some preserved life where law demanded death, some taught compassion where fear ruled, and in these acts, small though they were, the city's humanity endured. The strength of Sparta lay not only in its soldiers, but in these women, who shaped and carried the invisible framework of the city's soul. The mountains of Taygetus, silent and eternal, continue to watch over the land. Their peaks, once witnesses to discarded children and whispered prayers, now hold the weight of history, myth, and moral reflection. Nature endured where human ambition faltered. The Eurotas flowed as it always had, indifferent to laws and rituals, to triumph and decay. The wind carried the stories, ensuring that the lessons of Sparta traveled beyond Laconia, reaching those who would listen. That discipline without compassion breeds fragility, that obsession with perfection exacts a cost, and that life, in its unpredictable resilience, cannot be entirely mastered. Sparta's influence rippled across history. Military strategists marveled at its discipline, educators admired its rigor, and philosophers debated its ethics. Yet in every account, there was a shadow. The cost of the system, the human price of perfection, the persistent question of whether the city had achieved greatness at the expense of its own soul. Sparta became a touchstone for discussions of ambition and morality, of law and humanity, of what it means to shape life according to a rigid vision. Its lessons endure because they are not simple. They are complex, haunting, and deeply human. Even in art and literature, the ghosts of Sparta live on. Poets describe the silence of its streets, the shadows of its mothers, the spirits of children abandoned but never forgotten. Pain and glory are inseparable in these tales, intertwined in ways that echo through the imagination. The city's story became a canvas upon which the human struggle for balance between order and freedom, ambition and compassion, could be explored. Every sculpture, every epic poem, every retelling preserved the memory of a civilization that had dared to reach beyond the ordinary, only to be reminded of its mortality. The ultimate lesson of Sparta lies not in its phalanxes, its walls, or its rituals, but in the enduring tension between aspiration and consequence. The pursuit of perfection, of control over life itself, is a seductive ideal. Sparta achieved brilliance and horror in equal measure. Its legacy is a mirror, reflecting both the heights that human society can attain and the depths to which it can fall when discipline eclipses empathy. History remembers the victories, but memory preserves the warnings, and myth ensures that the lessons are never forgotten. Standing among the ruins, one can almost hear the city breathe. The cadence of torches in darkened temples, the whispers of mothers teaching their children, the silent footsteps of soldiers long gone. And in the wind, the faintest sound, perhaps imagined, perhaps real, of infants' cries carried down from Taygetus, a reminder that life persists in ways the city could never fully command. The mountains hold the echoes of triumph and tragedy alike, keeping the memory of human ambition and human cost alive for all who choose to listen. In the end, Sparta is both legend and warning, a civilization immortalized not solely in stone, in history, or in myth, but in the haunting interplay of human desire and divine judgment. Its rituals, its sacrifices, and its relentless pursuit of strength are stories that illuminate the profound tension between ambition and morality. The echoes of the city remind us that while human beings can strive for greatness, they are never fully masters of life, and that the cost of perfection is often higher than any law can justify. As night settles over the ancient city and the last rays of sunlight vanish behind the mountains, Sparta stands as a testament to discipline and its consequences, to ambition and its costs, to the fragile brilliance of human civilization. And somewhere in the wind, in the quiet spaces between stone and shadow, the whispers of the past endure. Not merely as a memory, but as a living warning, a story that bridges history, myth, and morality. Sparta, in its perfection and its tragedy, remains forever a city of ghosts and echoes, a civilization that reached toward the divine and found instead the fragile, haunting truth of mortality. Its story, told through centuries of myth and history, lingers like the last torchlight in a darkened temple, a light illuminating both human potential and human fallibility. A reminder that every ambition carries its cost, and that even the mightiest city must reckon with the limits of life, the weight of compassion, and the enduring power of memory. And so, the tale of Sparta concludes not with a battle cry or a final conquest, but with reflection, a pause in the centuries. A space to consider the balance between greatness and morality, between ambition and humanity, and between law and the quiet, unyielding rhythm of life itself.